You are correct. Something is seriously wrong.
Thus begins Attensity, a manifesto of the attention liberation movement, a call to consciousness and a call to action, and a message about the moment we live in, the big data era, the brain rot era. It affects basically every aspect of our lives.
Our economy, our politics, it mediates our relationships, it has infiltrated our minds, and we have to take this seriously.
Now, I've read a lot of books on this issue, trying to understand how we have gotten here. I've consumed a lot of brain rot content, and I've consumed a lot of content about how to fight brain rot, and here I am cranking out a little bit of my own. I just want to share some of the things I learned from this book in particular. This was unlike any of the books I've read about internet, social media addiction, the attention economy thus far. It's primarily an exposition of the manifesto, each chapter elaborating upon it line by line. And I appreciate it in the ways that it was different, but I also have some criticisms, more on that later. So this is my review of the book, but also my thoughts about the movement in general. The first thing that makes this book interesting is that it was written by a collective called the Friends of Attention. Who are these people? They describe themselves as
a loose and formal network of creative collaborators, colleagues, and actual friends who share an interest in attention. They started gathering around 2018, getting involved in various attention-centered programs before deciding to create their own.
I'll talk about them more at the end, but just know that they gather and work around the concept of attention activism, which is what this manifesto and book is about, so let's just get into it. Starting with, hey, what's the problem? They call it human fracking.
Just as with hydraulic fracturing, where high-pressure fluid is pumped into shale rock in order to create fractures in shale and release hydrocarbons, big data is pumping us with content in order to extract our attention. The digiverse is seemingly free.
But as we all probably know by now, that's because we are the products. Our attention has been commodified. And to the Friends of Attention, that means that our humanity has been commodified. This situation, they say, runs contrary to our basic wellness. Attensity isn't heavy on the statistics, and be warned, you won't find any citations here, but it does make one brief attempt to appeal to what the numbers are saying about how the attention economy is affecting us.
Hopelessness among high school students has increased by 40%, girls are at greater risk, and there has been an unprecedented spike in deaths of despair.
Here's the problem. The science isn't straight.
The first statistic they are most likely referring to does not say hopelessness has increased by 40%, only that in a poll administered to high school students, 40% report persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. Now that is up from the 30% reported in 2013, but that's a 10% jump, not 40. Also, it's 2 points down from 2021. However, other sources do indicate that adolescent depression is on the rise, such as this report from the Journal of Adolescent Health, which says that rates of teen depression increased from 8.1% in 2009 to 15.8% in 2019. Since 2018, hospitalizations for mental health reasons have increased, especially for girls, that's true.
But here's the thing, this doesn't account for a whole host of other tricky variables. My favorite podcast at the moment is If Books Could Kill, in which the hosts very thoroughly take apart self-help and nonfiction books like airport books. And I just listened to their episode on The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, a book I've been curious about because honestly, its baseline assumptions support a lot of what I already believe about how social media is affecting children. You know, that the kids are not all right. But their critique is that this book is essentially riddled with bad science. For example, let's look back at that increase in hospitalizations. This trend was first noted around 2010, but Peter and Michael, the hosts of the podcast, note that something else was also going on around that time. And that was Obamacare. Suddenly, a lot more youths had access to healthcare. Mental health screenings increased. Also, let's talk about the deaths of despair, in particular, suicide rates. According to the CDC, yes, suicide rates are on the rise, but compare this to the spike of rates in the late 1980s.
And we see there's a problem with saying that this is an unprecedented crisis that can be solely attributed to social media. That certainly wasn't the case in the 80s.
It's not to say that it's not a cause or even the cause, just that we can't be certain about what other factors are at play. Also, we know that a lot of the studies that log how much time kids are spending on their screens don't make many differentiations between the different apps or websites that kids might be using. Like, they don't parse out whether the kid is looking at porn or Wikipedia. Even Jonathan Haidt in his book acknowledges that video games aren't wholesale harmful, that it depends on the game and how much time a kid is spending playing it. But he doesn't afford the same kind of nuance to social media. Maybe because it would undermine his premise that phone's bad. I bring up this episode If Books Could Kill because Attensity actually refers a lot to Jonathan Haidt's book and all the studies that he's organized his theory under, so we have a problem here. If the argument that the attention activists are making is that something has to be done because of all the research that shows how harmful our phones are, it sort of falls apart because basically the verdict is just not in. Fortunately, something that this book does well is tackle that issue head on. It turns out that this lack of consensus might not be the problem that we think it is. While Attensity refers to the real evidence that our attention is being co-opted by big data to the detriment of our humanity, it also notes that there are many experts, academics, and professionals who argue against interpreting the data this way. They acknowledge that proving causality is hard, but that like with other social issues in history, people don't have the privilege of waiting for all the numbers to come in before acting. Even in the If Books Could Kill episode on Jonathan Haidt, Michael and Peter repeatedly acknowledge that even though there are a lot of issues with the science, they can't help but feel that social media usage must be causing some harm. Their critique is less ideological and more about the methodology. They agree with the basic argument that there is a problem with enrolling a bunch of kids in basically a society-wide experiment, giving them access to something profoundly affecting without first knowing what the research has said about these effects. Attensity says that by the time this research is clear, it may be too late. What this book is not is a data-driven argument. There are a lot of other books out there like that, if that's what you're looking for. This is a manifesto. It is speaking to your gut, not making an appeal to authority. There's a really important reason for this. The book takes a little bit of a look at the history of scientific controversies, most prominently at the history of race science. While Martin Luther King was studying philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the most prominent intellectuals at the Harvard University Department of Anthropology, Professor Carlton Stevens Kuhn, was teaching scientific racism, which was widely accepted at the time. The Friends of Attention argued that were King and Professor Kuhn to come head-to-head in a debate during that period, Martin Luther King would not have been able to defeat Kuhn's arguments on the basis of the scientific discourse that was, at that time, acceptable. Although King argued in the book Strength to Love that science did not, in fact, support racial discrimination, he was also critical of scientific materialism in general, saying that atoms and electrons are not the stuff of human personality. While he seemed to accept Darwinian evolution, at the end of the day, his argument relied on a divine view of humanity, a belief that all are made in the image of God. It was not too long after this that science did catch up. Scientific racism was overturned by new anthropological theories, which argue that race is not a scientific category. That has been the consensus ever since. But King and other activists didn't wait for consensus. Women certainly didn't wait for the world to totally wisen up to its essentialist attitudes before demanding their rights. And a good thing too, it turns out that even when the science is clear, these problems persist. The goal and challenge at the heart of activism is to get people to see what, as Attensity puts it, is a little off the radar screen. But there's another problem with waiting for the science to catch up on this particular issue, and that's because maybe the way we have researched attention is part of the problem. Now we get to what Attensity calls the catastrophic lie. This refers to the fact that attention has been studied in a very narrowly defined way. In research, it is treated as
quantifiable, durational, cybernetic, and visual. We can track the development of this theory of attention back to during World War II, when the military became interested in human beings' operational capacities.
The leading theory of attention through the second half of the 20th century was developed by Donald Broadbent, a head researcher in the Applied Psychological Unit at Cambridge, which was studying RAF pilots with the goal to prevent human failure in high-stakes systems and situations. He came up with the filter model of attention, which had a lot to do with
how long a person can look at a radar screen, how much information they can handle coming in. Broadbent was working during the time that computers were coming on the scene and was one of the first to compare human cognition to computation.
Starting in the 90s, newer research was beginning to understand the issues with these premises about human attention, but the idea that it's all about duration or selecting for a task is still prevalent.
Attention nowadays is tested through visual search tasks and continuous performance tasks. It's mostly of interest in the realms of workplace ergonomics and education science. It's become much more about the optimization of productivity. Neuroimaging looks at it in terms of control, suppression, and resource and goal maintenance. We can also trace a lot of research back to its connection to the advertisement industry. Edward Bernays, nephew of the Siggy Freud, developed psychological concepts for the utilization of marketing for major tobacco and food corporations and for political campaigns. He wrote in his book Propaganda in 1928, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Social media is, in a lot of ways, his legacy."
This is the modern foundation for our understanding and interest in attention. Writers of Attensity ask, is that the attention we are fighting to get back from the frackers? That which is defined as the capacity to select for a task. They argue that attention can and should mean so much more than that. That by fretting so much about our attention spans and productivity, we are thinking in the very terms that are being used to exploit us. We are more than input-output, stimulus and response machines. We are not merely quantifiable. We, they say, don't want to scrap for slightly longer attention spans or use their apps to train ourselves to a higher pitch of cybernetic focus. We want human attention. What is that? What is human attention? Well, they don't say too much about this. They say more about what it's not. Eyeballs on a screen. But maybe the job of a manifesto is not to tell you what to think, but to encourage you to think differently. This is what I did understand about their definition of human attention. The kind of attention worth saving stands between two traditions. The first we've talked a lot about is this task-directed kind of attention. Attention as a tool. The second is completely opposed. It's a kind of being present that is totally passive or contemplative. The attention activists advocate for a third way, somewhere in the middle. The way they describe it is kind of opaque and poetic. It is like an empty cup, presence as an offering, the gift of openness, the making space for whatever unfolds. They quote Simone Weil here. Attention taken to its highest degree is the same thing as prayer. I think what they're getting at here is a kind of attentiveness that is both receptive, but also requires you to put yourself into the world. It's passive and active at the same time. It requires engagement. Things get a little clearer when they draw from William James, one of the great early psychologists who, along with a phenomenologist and artist of the early 20th century, had a different notion of attention than what later became popular in the 50s. About William James, the book says,
"In his telling, the pinpoint of focus that locks statically on an object cannot really be called attention at all. For him, it's really a kind of inert stultification. Imagine, for instance, the dead-eyed, glassy, vacant gaze of a human being going fully vegetative while scrolling on the phone. Is that attention?" James came to believe that in the healthy state, a human mind was basically incapable of simply staying with a discrete object for more than a moment. It was, in his view, in the essential nature of human cognition to be dynamic, to be moving, to be constantly in what he called the stream of consciousness. The alternatives weren't focus or attention. They were really just a kind of spirit death. They go on to describe attention as a restless circling, symbolized perhaps by the looping rings of the spirograph. They call it a sort of centripetal distraction and say that the real genius of attention is the ability again and again to bend the path of those moving thoughts back around to the object.
I appreciate that they also play around the definition of distraction here.
In our preoccupation with attention spans and worries about kids having ADHD,
by the way, I don't want to discount any ADHD diagnoses here. I have one too.
We might look at certain moments of distraction as problematic. The book describes a child looking out the window, a behavior that might be reprimanded by a teacher. They question this scenario. What if looking out the window is just the special kind of attention we need? What the teacher calls distraction might be a form of unauthorized attention, attention that is not in line with the expectations of whoever's in charge.
Sorry to throw teachers under the bus here. You're doing great work. This just illustrates a point. It's not your fault that the form schooling now takes, by and large, is a product of the Industrial Revolution, has a very specific task-oriented end in mind. As we'll see later, the attention activists deeply value schooling and study, but again, just not in the forms that we're used to. Anyway, I know it's been a major point to say so far how fraught science might be on this issue, but I do want to briefly mention this ASAP video that I saw recently, which explores how mind-watering might not be this evil thing we used to think it was. In fact, it might serve a very specific and crucial function in the brain. Turns out when you zone out, your brain might do a micro version of what it does in deep sleep, which is to give your brain a sort of bath. It flushes out the toxins. Anyway, fun fact. Okay, this all seems nice, if a little hazy, but how do we fight for it? What does attention activism look like? That, I think, is really what the book is about. Its goal is to mobilize, to move you to act, and the Friends of Attention argue that this is an issue that a lot of other social issues could hinge upon. One of the effects of the internet, they say, has been political apathy, disassociation. Not only are we being dehumanized, but our ability to care is being captured and commodified. Slight segue real quick, but a lot of the language in this book feels very Heideggerian to me at times, including the part about our humanity being connected to our ability to care. There's a section in Heidegger's Being in Time titled Being as Care, where he describes that what it feels like to be human is to care, to be concerned with the world. This care actually structures our existential situation, our reality.
Being, for humans, means being with the world and the things in the world. This overturns that split between subject and object, a la Descartes' abstraction, because we do not first and foremost engage the world that way. We are embodied. It's being in the world, not being and the world. By structuring our attention, big tech structures our care and mode of our being in the world.
This also takes me back just a minute ago to that thing about distraction, because Heidegger also sort of flips this idea on its head. He talks about curiosity, not in the necessarily positive way that we might conceive of it, but in a way that kind of opposes true understanding. True understanding is what happens in our engagement with the world and projecting ourselves into it. Curiosity seeks novelty. It's characterized by a specific way of
not tarrying alongside what is closest, does not seek the leisure of tarrying observantly, but rather seeks restlessness and the excitement of continual novelty and changing encounters. In not tarrying, curiosity is concerned with the constant possibility of distraction, which we call the character of never dwelling anywhere. Curiosity is everywhere and nowhere. This mode of being in the world reveals a new kind of being of everyday Dasein, a kind in which Dasein is constantly uprooting itself. So that takes us back to how maybe staring at a window, watching what's going on in the world, is a way of being in the world that being on your phone just cannot give you. But unfortunately, nobody makes any money when we just stare out the window or tarry with the things beside and in front of us.
Which includes all of the great issues we are facing: economic, ecological, social, civil, political. Our beings and our relationships have been reduced to that which can be quantified, bought, and sold. From Homo economicus to Homo attentis. We are subjects of surveillance capitalism.
Big Brother is not, in this case, so much the government as it is Silicon Valley, but we like our toys, we love our smartphones, we're attached to them, so what's the deal? Well, that's the genius of big tech. It has wormed its way into our innermost drives and needs. It has manufactured our desires. We feel like we choose it, even though a lot of us feel ill about it.
What is important in any movement, they argue, is that we accept that deceit and exploitation are never inevitable. They quote Barrington Moore, a political sociologist, who said,
"People are inclined to grant legitimacy to anything that is or seems inevitable, no matter how painful it may be. So people must perceive their situation as one they need not, cannot, and ought not to endure."
Is the activist's job to undermine the old sense of inevitability. And that is what the Friends of Attention are trying to do. When it comes to attention activism, the kinds of historical movements it might mirror
is nothing like the French Revolution. It's more like the exercise revolution because, not too long ago, running shoes didn't exist. People didn't exercise on purpose, really, barring some ancient practices like martial arts or Olympic training. But that wasn't for anyone and everyone, and people didn't just become interested in purposeful movement or even nutrition because suddenly we discovered how important they were. In a lot of ways, they became more important in the 20th century because we were starting to feel the effects of sedentary lifestyles and processed foods.
Likewise, the internet and social media and the attention economy pose us with new problems. The Friends of Attention wager that attentional wellness, which they mean as the training, conditioning, and maintenance of our attentional capacities, will be understood as a basic good by 2040. We've talked about this concern already. We're all worried about our attention spans, and I think the simultaneous rise of meditation apps and app blockers demonstrate that. But they also hope that this movement won't just be about productivity, but about deepening our relationship with the world. And what I've learned is that it isn't enough just to get offline, to do the digital detox, to get a dumb phone or dumbify your smartphone, all of which I have done and truly do value. What I learned when I started logging off is that I do not know what to do with myself. I was so used to one mode of being, and even offline I feel so twitchy and disassociated.
Our attentional habits are learned from our parents, from the schooling we've received, and from our informational environment. Fortunately, things that are learned can be unlearned. Training and study or practice are essential to the attention activist cause. We have to learn the kinds of attention that aren't engineered to maximize online engagement, and some of this learning can happen in isolation. Meditation is a helpful outlet, reading, downgrading your tech. All important and helpful, and in the face of a systemic issue, not enough. The system we are up against is the most complex system to ever be created by human beings.
Okay, so this is obviously the core of the book. It's unlike other books that are about what you can do to improve your relationship with technology. It's how we can change our collective environment, our collective relationship as it's mediated now through technology. Because the appropriate feeling shouldn't be personal shame, but political anger. But don't worry, they're not asking you to tear down the cotton mill. They aren't Luddites. They consider themselves pro-technology. What they want to do is a kind of consciousness raising that echoes the way Karl Marx drew attention to the mechanisms of capitalism. Whatever you think about Karl Marx and his economic/political legacy, he was a master in dialectic thinking. Attensity describes dialectical thinking as a sort of pivoting or flipping regarding our base assumptions. So what Marx saw was that in a capitalist system, we're kind of mystified about where value comes from. We live on the assumption that money or commodities are inherently valuable, almost in a metaphysical sense. This is what is meant by commodity fetishism. The reality, though, is that the real economic powerhouse lies in the labor force. That labor gets hidden by all the abstractions our economy operates by, but ultimately it's the working people that make the world turn. Similarly, the attention economy appears to turn attention into value, but really, it's the other way around. It's the attention itself that makes things valuable. Fortunately, it might be easier for attention activists to gain back power than labor movements because, in this case, the means of production is our minds. Instead of withholding our labor, maybe we can withhold our attention. And this is super important because, as mentioned earlier, a consequence of the attention economy is the capture of our ability to care. A lot of us are kind of constantly battling a sort of doomer mentality. The book quotes Marshall Berman, a Marxist critic in the 1970s, who said, "We must grow from apocalypse to dialectic." Friends of Attention put this in their own words. Apocalypse, the end of the universe, total failure. Dialectic, the pivot. Activists aren't in the business of, or they shouldn't be, of creating or inventing crises, but they do have to realize that every crisis sets up the conditions of new possibility. Unsustainable conditions, contradictions, means something's gotta give. Set against a politics of despair, where we are prone to disbelieve in our political agency and that pessimism is just realism, attention activism seeks to repoliticize public life this way. In the words of Diva R. Woodley, we change our ideas, we change our minds, we change associations, we change public understandings, we change the scope of political possibility. The Friends of Attention say that attention activism is a fight for justice, but it's the justice of the sash, meaning you refuse to give your eyeballs to the eyeball merchants. The sash, they say, stands for our ability to withhold our attention from one thing and therefore to direct it elsewhere. It represents the right to refuse the world as it is presented to us. This makes me think of the last chapter in Byung-Chul Han's book Psychopolitics. The chapter's titled Idiotism. He starts out quoting Guy Deleuze saying, "Playing the fool, that's always been one function of philosophy." Han designates the idiot as a type of outsider, as someone who embodies a heretical consciousness. This paragraph that really reminds me of what's being said here in Attensity.
Intelligence means choosing between. It is not entirely free insofar as it is caught in a between, which depends on the system and operation. Intelligence has no access to outside because it makes a choice between options in a system. Therefore, intelligence does not really exercise free choice. In contrast, the idiot has contact with the vertical dimension insomuch as he takes leave of the prevailing system, that is, abandons intelligence.
This definition of intelligence parallels the narrow form of attention discussed earlier, the kind that is all about selecting for a task. The attention we give to our smartphones is not free, it is subject to an algorithmic system. Maybe downgrading our tech, dumbifying our phone is a form of idiotism. Maybe going offline is a form of heretical consciousness. Dialectical consciousness, heretical consciousness, forms of consciousness raising for the attention activist comes about through study. This is why the Friends of Attention created the Strother School for Radical Attention. Their library offers a lot of resources related to the philosophy and politics of attention, and in the book they name a bunch of traditional and contemporary writers and thinkers alike. St. Francis, Buddhaghosa, Simone Weil, Nicholas Carr, Shoshana Zuboff. So they encourage you to read up. But also, the school is about coalition building. It means building
attention sanctuaries. Maybe we can think of these sanctuaries as the third spaces that so many have spoken of as late as being endangered. It can even mean Zoom meetings. It includes using the tools we are critiquing, like YouTube. We shouldn't throw the baby out, and at one point the book describes attention activists as the clownfish that learned to live inside the poison tendrils of anemones. But more refreshingly, we can return to libraries, to museums, You know, your local library offers a lot of community programs and they're free. It is important to have places and spaces away from the attention economy to remind us there are other ways of being and other ways of wanting. It's important to have times of Sabbath, and as they put it, sites of dreaming, because the sleeper cannot be fracked.
Speaking of dreamers, there's a chapter dedicated to dreamers and artists and thinkers who demonstrate that art is an attention-holding architecture. That an artist is a person who attends and creates attentional situations. It also says that art has a funny way of thinking otherwise, of spinning apocalypse into dialectic. It mentions people like Jenny Odell, the Fluxus Group, and an organization called the Order of the Bird that was pretty intriguing. The Order of the Bird gathers in front of pieces of art or charismatic objects, like little mini flash mobs, and sometimes they'll stand vigil in front of it all night long. That's a lot, but it's pretty admirable. Attention activists can come in many shapes and sizes. The book draws upon the 1834 revolt in Lyon when people used all kinds of household objects to create a barricade. They used tables and chairs and soup pots and pitchforks. So the book lists the varieties that attention activists can come in: amateurs, crafters, operators, gatherers, countercoders, monkey wrenchers, gamers, players, spectators, parents, epimolets, bards, reciters, fandoms, puzzlers. They also call upon us to use our inherited tools wherever they might come from. For example, the tradition that I come from is Mormonism. I'm no longer affiliated with the church, but I can appreciate some of the gifts they've given me as I let go of what no longer serves me. For instance, something that I really hated at the time but actually really miss now is the practice of just sitting and listening in a reverent setting. Mormons have a pretty subdued, somberish church meeting in my experience, and even though at the time that felt boring, I actually recognized that in those conditions I was able to reach a state of mind that honestly is pretty difficult to replicate now. There's something about not just sitting alone quietly, I was sitting quietly in a room full of other people who were also sitting quietly, and we had all our hearts and minds turned to the same subject that felt bigger than us. That's something I hope to find again, but that I certainly have not found on the internet, but I'm really glad that I had that experience and appreciation, and so might be able to suss out the conditions that can create that sort of feeling and community. We also need to start exercising our imaginations. Predictions and the Friends of Attention don't necessarily claim to make any, but we do have to try to project ourselves into better futures. They cite Hannah Arendt's 1971 essay, Lying in Politics, where she talks about how the relationship between visionary politics and tell it like it is truth is complex. Imagination does not equal delusion. Literary theorists call it hyperstition, a tale that has the power to make itself true. Some are good, some aren't, but we evaluate them on the basis of what worlds they bring into being. It's a by their fruit you shall know them kind of thing. This kind of makes me think of Lauren Berlant's book Cruel Optimism, where she defines cruel optimism as this feeling, this affect. It has us pursuing things that undermine our happiness. Take the most basic example, the pursuit of wealth.
When you sell your time and sign your life away in order to make money, in order to have time and live a life doing the things you want to do, only you can't because you're too busy working. It's like trying to get somewhere by running on the treadmill. But obviously we want to avoid that kind of optimism or hope for the future, but we also don't want to give in to nihilism. So I wonder if the alternative here, the one Hannah Arendt might be talking about, could be some kind of functional optimism or an essential optimism. The attention activists are optimistic about the work being done to combat the attention economy. Unfortunately, this is where the book starts to get a little iffy for me. I've been pretty neutral and positive about this book so far, and overall that's how I feel about it. I know a lot of people are annoyed and disappointed by this book because there aren't any citations, it isn't data-driven, and it uses a lot of purpley, passionate language. It sort of reminded me of the cadence of the School of Life videos.
And therefore that the next 40 minutes or 3 hours would be a polite hell haunted by the spectre of eternal solitude.
I had my issues with that too. The language was at sometimes sort of cringe, but I'm also wary of this feeling of cringe because, hello, on the internet, sincerity is cringe. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but I'm really working to fight through my own irony poisoning and cringe reflex. That being said, it does feel a bit much at times. This doesn't really have to do with the book, but I was reading this article the other day written by one of the Friends of Attention members that mentions a program called Abstinence. And that name, I mean, whatever, names are supposed to be catchy. It's a strategy and it makes sense. But then I was looking around on their website and I came across this fun little glossary. In telephone, crabstinence. I said I'm trying to overcome my cringe reflex and this isn't really helping. I guess it's a program for Gen Z, but y'all are younger than me and a lot cooler, so I don't know who this would appeal to. Although I agree with what you're doing. Anyway, back to the book. I feel like I was able to get into the rhythm of the language, or at least not let it turn me off. Look, I know it's basic, but I still get some good stuff out of the School of Life videos, okay? Recognize that, again, this is a manifesto, and it's crafted to read like many of the great manifestos of history. You know, like a specter is haunting Europe. Man, that inveterate dreamer, daily more discontent with his destiny. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Imperfect, grandiose, but mobilizing. Some people say this book is for those who already believe in its cause. And this is for people, probably, who agree with the first line. You are correct. Something is seriously wrong. I really didn't need to be convinced. I think I needed to feel inspired, to feel that functional optimism. My biggest issue, probably, would be that the Friends of Attention here kind of laud several pieces of legislation that I think are potentially problematic. One of them is the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA. And one of the core aspects of KOSA is this thing called duty of care, the goal of which is to prevent minors from being exposed to harmful content on the internet. Some of this is like, well, duh, content related to eating disorders, porn. Also, civil rights groups, digital activists, and even child safety organizations worry that later interpretations of this law could also include censoring LGBTQ content. I really like this video by the YouTube channel Struthless. He provided a pretty comprehensive pros-cons list about the social media ban in Australia that recently took effect. I really recommend you watch it. He, like me, really wants interventions like this to work, but they come with a lot of crucial questions. For instance, the issue of enforcing social media bans for minors under the age of 16. This could require some sort of age verification system that could lead to everyone, not just children, being issued state-authorized digital IDs, leading to more government surveillance and privacy issues. Also, we know that when something is prohibited, people often find a way around this, which could mean kids go underground or try accessing more dark, webby corners of the internet. I totally agree that despite not knowing all the answers, some action needs to be taken. Coalition building and workshops and the creation of third spaces is awesome. But when it comes to legislation, I do think we have to be careful about the actions we take, and that's not really acknowledged here at all. Maybe they felt the need to refer to some concrete form of activism or political change that these legislative moves represent, but I think some disclaimers should have been made. Okay, so now you sort of know the problems and you sort of know the solutions. What next? Well, honestly, you could just go fart around on their website for a while.
You can enroll in workshops, check out their attention labs, you can attend their First Friday meetings, they have some interesting speakers for those. You can find a lot of resources like their 12 Theses of Attention, short films based on the 12 Theses, and you should definitely look through their Attention Trove if you want more foundational text type stuff. If you want to dig more into the philosophy of attention, there's a ton of free documents there.
Ultimately, this book is a conversation starter. I think it's only in the last few years that people have really started taking this issue truly seriously. And a lot of people have been talking about the next renaissance, so who knows, this could be a watershed moment. I think we've spent a lot of time so far talking about how much the internet sucks these days and about going offline, but we also need to talk about what we are going to do once we are offline. We have a lot of unlearning to do together. So tell me what you think about this conversation. Have you read the book? How do you feel about attention activism as a whole? Do you have any ideas? As always, I want to hear what you think. Thanks for paying attention this long and sticking with me thus far. If you want more content like this, be sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time.